You've barely stepped off the road when you see it, a field of nibbled greens, leaves skeletonized, rows of kale reduced to twigs. You crouch beside a furrow and lift one limp stalk on its underside. A fat, bristly caterpillar wriggles lazily as if nothing is wrong, except everything is wrong. It's late spring, around 1457, in the region of Savoy, part of present-day France. The crops should be booming, but instead they're collapsing. The culprit. Processionary caterpillars, fuzzy inch-long and marching in horrifying numbers across every edible surface. These aren't metaphorical plagues. They're six-legged leaf blenders. The villagers, mostly subsistence farmers, are out of options. They've tried prayer. They've tried herbal remedies. They've tried squishing. But the bugs keep coming. And so desperate and deeply medieval, they turn to the only authority. They still trust the church. Not for blessings, but for a lawsuit. Here's the thing, in medieval Europe, people really did put animals on trial. Pigs, rats, weevils, even locusts. They believed that God's justice extended to all his creations. If a dog bit someone, it might be hanged. If a cow wandered into a church, it might be excommunicated. And if a horde of caterpillars ate all your spinach, you filed a court case. Sounds bizarre now, sure. But this made perfect sense in a worldview where everything, crop failures, illness, eclipses, was part of a moral order. And when that order broke, someone had to answer. So tonight you're a witness, a sleepy traveler leaning on a wooden fence as word spreads through the village. The caterpillars are going to trial. You overhear a priest pacing through the square, his robe muddy, his voice tired. A summons shall be issued, he says in the name of the bishop, to the insects, that they might answer for their crimes. Someone snorts. Well, you do, throw 'em in the stocks. But no one laughs for long, because they remember the stories. Pigs hanged for murder. Termites threatened with holy wrath. Stranger things have happened. And in the Middle Ages, you don't question whether a caterpillar can be summoned. You just ask where to serve the notice. You follow the procession to the parish hall, a cramped stone room smelling faintly of damp wood and incense. A scribe leans over a scroll quill scratching. A few farmers argue over the exact borders of the infested fields. And on a splintered bench near the altar, a young priest is muttering, Latin eyes closed, as though preparing to speak to God or a swarm of insects. Historians still argue whether these trials were sincere attempts at justice or more theatrical rituals meant to calm a panicked population. Some say the church used them to reassert its role as mediator between man and nature. Others think it was just a very elaborate way to manage collective grief, like yelling at a thunderstorm to make yourself feel heard. But back in this flickering little hall, no one's debating philosophy. They're just scared. The caterpillars have returned every spring for 3 years. Every time they come back hungrier. People are starving. Babies aren't making it past weaning age. And superstition is thick in the air. You see it in the way a farmer crosses himself when a moth flutters by. You hear it in the hushed talk of punishment of sin. Perhaps someone whispers, this is for the baker's daughter and her baby. A scandal, barely buried. Superstition and survival are tangled here. You feel it as you step back outside into the cool evening, the wind brushing against your ears like ghostly whispers. Fields stretch out under a silver moon, and somewhere in the tall grass you swear you hear chewing. Tiny, determined chewing. By the next morning, you're standing in the village square again, only now it's transformed into something far stranger. There's a makeshift podium of crates and wine barrels. A carved wooden crucifix has been hauled in and propped up beside a barrel of dried beans. And at the center of it all is a hand-inked parchment nailed to a post, the summons. In formal Latin, with far more dignity than the situation seems to warrant, it commands the caterpillars to appear before a court convened in 3 days' time. It lists their crimes: devouring of God's green bounty, incursion upon human lands, threat to divine order. You can't help but read it twice, your eyes catching on the phrase, bestiae immundae, unclean beasts. The villagers gather to listen as the town priest reads it aloud. His voice is steady, but his eyebrows twitch as though even he's struggling not to smirk. And yet, no one laughs. That's the strange part. This absurdity is treated with total seriousness. Maybe it's because laughing too loud would feel like mocking the church. Or maybe it's because people are genuinely that afraid of famine, of chaos, of the sense that even nature is turning against them. You glance toward the fields, and sure enough, the caterpillars are still there, inching, munching, thriving. And so the preparations begin. The bishop far away in a larger city has agreed to send a legal representative to oversee the proceedings. But someone needs to speak for you, the accused. And that's when you first hear the name Father Bartholomew. He's a young, quiet clergyman from a neighboring town. Educated, soft-spoken, painfully sincere. And yes, he's going to defend the caterpillars. You watch as he arrives on a borrowed mule, carrying a leather satchel and a rolled-up robe of his own. His face is pale. He looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe helping someone give confession or picking herbs in silence. But he's been appointed by the church to argue on behalf of the insects, and he intends to do it properly. You follow him to the monastery guest house, where he sets out his books in neat little stacks, mostly theological texts, but one peculiar volume you don't recognize. He spends hours flipping through it, muttering. You lean close enough to catch a phrase. Dominion over the beast must be just, or it is sin. Now you're curious. Because here's the thing, these trials weren't always mockery. Theologians like St. Augustine had long debated whether animals had moral standing. Did they have souls? Could they sin? Could they be forgiven? And in legal traditions, going back to Roman times, there was this strange loophole. Anything that could cause harm could theoretically be held accountable. Which leads us to now. A swarm of caterpillars is about to stand trial for their crimes. Well, not stand exactly. Now that becomes clear when the bailiff, a red-nosed farmer with a slightly torn robe, asks in all seriousness, So, where should the bugs sit? There's an awkward silence. Then someone suggests an empty wooden crate. You can't decide what's more surreal, that the court plans to address the insects directly, or that Father Bartholomew is now writing a statement defending them as if they might actually reply. As he scribbles, you hear the first argument start to form. The prosecution, represented by an older priest named Father Dennis, is preparing to argue that the caterpillars are an unnatural scourge sent by God as a punishment, but also subject to excommunication if they refuse to leave. His tone is fire and brimstone, all clenched fists and thunder. Father Bartholomew, in contrast, is planning to claim that the caterpillars, like all creatures, were made by God and have a place in the world. If they're here, it's because nature allowed them to be, and therefore they should be treated not as criminals, but as fellow members of creation. It's a bold angle. Historians still argue whether such defenses were ever truly believed, or if they were more ritual than reason, part of a larger cosmic theater, where every player, even a bug, had its role. But Father Bartholomew, he seems to believe it, utterly. That night, as the village prepares for the trial, you wander the fields again. The moonlight is softer now, the sky clear. You run your hand over the leaves. More caterpillars. Always more. In the distance, you hear a child say, "They'll be gone," after the priest yells at them. You almost smile. And then a strange thing happens. A bat swoops overhead. The caterpillars don't flinch. They just keep chewing, oblivious to their pending court date, which you think might be the most innocent thing of all. 3 days later, you're standing beneath the arched doorway of a cold stone building, the town's chapter house repurposed for court. It smells like wax, wet wool, and regret. Inside benches have been rearranged to resemble a courtroom, or at least what a medieval village thinks one should look like. At the center, a raised dais with a heavy oak chair where the bishop's appointed judge, Canon Etienne, sits with furrowed brow and a wax-sealed ledger. He looks vaguely annoyed, as if he'd rather be at vespers or drinking something mulled. On either side of him, clerics stand stiffly with scrolls and ink-stained sleeves, their expressions pinched with holy authority. You take a seat on a creaky bench near the back, trying to stay warm. The place is packed. Farmers, shepherds, merchants, even a couple of goats, tethered outside chewing rope like they want in on the action. A child is whispering, "Will they bring the caterpillars in chains?" They won't, of course. But the scribe still reads the official summons aloud, just in case the bugs want to make an entrance. He clears his throat. "In the name of the Holy Church and His Holiness, the Bishop of Autumn, we do hereby summon the creatures known as caterpillars, found in the fields beyond Saint-Lucien, to answer for crimes of consumption and desecration, that they may face judgment as is right and just." He pauses. Nothing happens? Of course nothing happens. It's a room full of humans staring at an empty crate. But no one comments. No one laughs. Because this is the ritual. The show must go on. The prosecutor, Father Dennis, rises. He is a tall, angular man with a booming voice and the kind of glare that could shrivel turnips. He launches into a monologue about pestilence, disobedience, and the crawling vermin sent to test the faithful. His Latin is excellent. His rage is theatrical. He quotes scripture. He gestures at the sky. He nearly knocks over a candle. And then he makes a demand the caterpillars must leave, by divine order, within 6 days, or face eternal banishment from the grace of God. The judge nods, solemnly scribbles something in the ledger, and then turns to the other side. Defense. Father Bartholomew stands still, a little pale, but with a calmness you didn't expect. He adjusts his robe, holds his hands together like someone about to deliver a bedtime homily, and begins. "Your Honor," he says softly, "these creatures, though destructive, are part of God's design. They have no voice. They have no intention. They do not sin." He speaks gently, like he's trying to explain something difficult to a nervous child. "They eat because they were made to eat. They move because they were given legs. To punish them is not justice, it is misunderstanding." He opens one of his books, quoting psalms about the beasts of the field and the lilies of the valley. He references St. Francis, who once preached to birds. He even notes that some monks kept beetles as companions, believing they were tiny, humble teachers of patience. A fringe argument, maybe. But he makes it beautifully. You glance around. Some in the room are frowning. Others look moved. A woman near the front clasps her hands and nods. A young scribe looks like he's about to cry. Historians still argue whether this speech recorded in fragmentary form in an obscure monastery log was meant as satire or a genuine plea for ecological mercy. But tonight, under the glow of beeswax candles, it feels real. Bartholomew ends with a flourish. "If these creatures are commanded to leave, let them do so with dignity, not damnation. Let us show mercy, not because they understand it, but because we do." You blink. The room is silent. The judge clears his throat. "Very well," he says. "The terms will be drafted." No one claps. No one cheers. But something in the air has shifted. The anger that boiled under the surface when the trial began now feels tired, quiet, resigned. The court is adjourned for the evening, and as people file out, you catch snippets of conversation. They might really leave, someone says. I heard a saint once commanded frogs to leave a city, and they did. Now you think he's right, that they don't know what they're doing. A woman shrugs. They eat. We eat. Who's to say which hunger is worse? You step out into the night, and the air feels cooler now. The stars are out. Somewhere in the grass, the caterpillars continue their slow, untroubled chewing. They don't know they've been summoned. They don't know they've been defended. And yet a courtroom full of people just spent an afternoon trying to make peace with them anyway. Maybe that's the real miracle. The next day arrives with drizzle. A soft, misty rain that soaks into your cloak and makes everything feel heavier. The court is scheduled to reconvene, not for final judgment yet, but to review terms. And as you walk through muddy lanes toward the chapter house again, you can't help but imagine the absurdity of what's about to happen. Because today, they're drafting a relocation agreement. Oh, yes, really. The caterpillars are being offered a compromise. If they vacate the main farmland within 6 days, they'll be spared excommunication. They'll even be granted sanctuary in a neutral pasture just beyond the parish boundary. You try not to laugh. You fail a little. Inside the court, the mood is subdued but serious. The same villagers occupy the benches, though now their whispers are more curious than angry. The judge is already seated, quill in hand, looking like he's writing a grocery list with divine consequence. Father Dennis presents the church's terms. The accused creatures shall, by the will of this holy body, be granted 6 full days to withdraw from the cultivated fields of Saint-Lucien and resettle in the scrublands west of the old river bend. He pauses dramatically. Failure to do so will result in excommunication and a general curse upon their kind. You hear someone murmur, "Isn't that just a bush?" Father Bartholomew rises, brushing his sleeves like he's preparing to speak in Parliament. My clients, he begins, not quite smiling, do not object to these terms. And there it is, the moment where everything crosses into full dream logic and somehow becomes even more plausible because of how solemn everyone's pretending to be. The judge nods. Let it be recorded, he says. The terms are agreed upon. They don't question whether the caterpillars can understand Latin. They don't even question whether they can move that far. They simply treat the contract like any other. Now the hard part begins enforcing it. You follow the procession into the fields that afternoon. A line of monks, priests, and local officials march toward the farmland. Like an army of very polite exorcists, they carry incense banners and a wooden crucifix. Bells ring. Psalms are chanted. And behind them, Father Bartholomew steps gingerly over clods of earth, occasionally stopping to read aloud from a scroll declaring the church's offer in a voice more used to funerals than lawsuits. You pause beside a cluster of turnip stalks and watch. The caterpillars keep inching along. One of them waves its bristly body seemingly in slow-motion protest before falling off a leaf. If this is compliance, it's not obvious. A child whispers. Maybe they're listening in their hearts. The ritual continues. The priests sprinkle holy water across the plants. They circle the worst-infested patches, marking boundaries with twine. They chant again this time in the direction of the western scrubland, a patch of brambles and weeds nobody farms because it's too rocky. That'll be their exile, says one farmer. Lucky bugs, another mutters. That's still more land than I've got. Historians still argue whether these rituals were intended as binding spiritual acts or merely symbolic performances to restore a sense of control. Some scholars suggest the real audience wasn't the bugs, it was the people. By witnessing the trial and its rituals, villagers could believe something was being done even if nature never actually listened. You stay out there until dusk, the procession long gone, the fields quiet again. The mist returns soft and whispering. You crouch by a patch of kale, waiting, watching. Nothing moves but the caterpillars. A few have wandered off, yes, but most remain. You count 10 on a single leaf. They chew like monks at supper, slow, methodical, silent. You wonder if this is what peace looks like, or if the church will see it as rebellion. Either way, the countdown has begun. 6 days until judgment. By day 3 of the 6-day ultimatum, tensions are squirmy. The caterpillars have not moved, or, well, some have. A few clusters have wandered toward the brambles, giving the optimists hope. But the majority remain firmly entrenched in the village's best-growing plots, like squatters who've discovered free salad bars and decided to lease indefinitely. You sit near the edge of a cabbage patch, arms wrapped around your knees, watching one of them inch lazily over a bitten stem. It raises its fuzzy head like it might deliver a rebuttal, then munches again. Villagers are losing patience. They gather in the square after sunset, cloaks pulled tight against the chill, arguing under lantern light. Father Dennis, ever the firebrand, wants to declare the caterpillars heretics now and begin the excommunication process immediately. They've been given mercy, he says, pounding the barrel he's using as a podium. They've ignored it. What more proof of wickedness do we require? Someone suggests they try crushing them again. Someone else points out they tried that last year, and it made things worse. They came back angrier, a baker says solemnly. You don't challenge that logic. Then Father Bartholomew clears his throat. I ask only, he says quietly, for patience. There are still 3 days. The creatures may yet obey. He's been spending those days wandering the fields, scroll in hand, continuing his rituals. You even see him one morning kneeling before a particularly dense patch of weeds, whispering what sounds like prayers to the air, or perhaps to the leaves. You can't help but admire the commitment. The bishop's representative, Canon Etienne, remains neutral. He's seen this before. In a town downriver, he once presided over a weevil trial. They were offered sanctuary, too, he says, between bites of dry bread. They refused. We cursed them. They vanished the next spring. Could have been divine judgment. Could have been weather. Who's to say? That's the thing. Historians still argue whether these trials had any measurable effect. Were they psychological bombs, elaborate displays of collective superstition, or some whisper did they actually work? It's easier to scoff now. But back then, people didn't laugh so easily, especially not when crops were dying. And in this village, hunger is always just one frost away. So the clergy keep at it. More incense, more chants. A monk is assigned to ring a bell every hour from dawn to dusk to remind the caterpillars of the deadline. You're not sure the caterpillars care, but it does unsettle the chickens. By day 5, spirits are fraying. The fields look even worse. Leaves are stripped down to veins. Roots are exposed. You pass a row of leeks that resemble tiny skeletons in dirt. The townspeople have started whispering again. About sin, about signs. One rumor claims the bugs arrived shortly after a villager skipped Sunday Mass 3 times in a row. Another swears they saw a caterpillar crawling over a crucifix carved into a stone wall, and that it didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Bartholomew keeps walking his peaceful rounds. He's thinner now, sleep-deprived, but his eyes are bright. He believes you realize not just in the trial, but in the possibility of understanding, of a world where even insects have roles and dignity. You watch him one evening as he addresses a patch of kale, voice soft. You are not hated, he says, but you must go. These people are hungry. There is land enough for all. A child nearby claps, whispering, he's talking to the bugs again. You want to believe they're listening. You almost believe it. But on the 6th morning, you step into the fields before sunrise, and the caterpillars are still there. You arrive at the courthouse early, damp, with fog, hoping maybe mute. The caterpillars had a change of heart overnight. They didn't. The final day of grace has passed, and the court is reconvening. The pews are fuller this time. People want closure, or a curse, Maybe both. Tension crackles like a dropped lantern. Father Dennis looks practically gleeful as he shuffles his notes and stands before the judge. Your Grace, he begins, the accused were granted mercy. They refused. They persist in their desecration. The time for tolerance is over. He gestures broadly. We request excommunication complete and final. You glance across the room. No one disagrees. Until Bartholomew rises. His voice is quieter today. Slower. Less like a firebrand, more like someone singing a lullaby to a storm. I do not deny the evidence, he says. The creatures have not moved. The crops are not safe. But I ask, is banishment the only answer? The judge blinks. So do several monks. Bartholomew continues. What do we achieve with curses, with declarations of doom? If this is punishment, are we punishing ignorance or survival? He reaches into his satchel and pulls out a tiny wax-sealed scroll. Carefully, he unrolls it. This, he says, is a letter from St. Emilian's monastery. 3 years ago, their vineyards were consumed by sparrows. They did not curse them. They planted decoys, rows of sacrificial grapes. The birds fed the wine returned. They adapted. Someone in the audience mutters, we don't have extra cabbage. But others are listening now. Bartholomew folds the scroll. I do not deny the damage. I ask only that we do not meet it with more destruction. You feel the room shift. Not toward forgiveness, but toward exhaustion. Historians still argue what exactly was meant by excommunication in these trials. In theory, it meant barring the creatures from divine protection. But some interpretations saw it as an actual curse, a spiritual severing that could by God's grace lead to their elimination. Lightning, plague, predatory birds sent like winged angels. In this case, Father Dennis has already prepared the ritual. You follow the crowd outside into the open field just past the church. It's overcast, the sky hung low and gray like damp wool. A table has been set with incense bread salt and a single burning candle. The ritual begins. Father Dennis leads the prayer arms lifted. A procession of monks chants in low, droning Latin. The candle is snuffed. The bread crumbles to dust. A crucifix is thrust into the earth, symbolically marking the caterpillar's spiritual exile. And then the declaration comes. In the name of the Holy Church, we sever thee, O corrupting beast, from the mercy of heaven. Let thine limbs fail, let thy kind wither. Let all birds know thy flesh as ash. The words hang in the air. A few people cheer, most just cross themselves. A child cries unclear whether from confusion or cold. And Bartholomew, he says nothing. He only bows his head and whispers something too quiet to catch. The ritual ends. The bell tolls once. Everyone disperses slowly, like a funeral without a body. You stay behind, watching the wind ripple the grass. A single caterpillar crawls across your boot. It does not seem cursed. Later that evening, at the tavern, debate roars. Some say the bugs will now drop dead overnight. Others insist nothing will change. A few are placing bets. You overhear someone mutter, why stop at caterpillars? We should curse the moles too. But Bartholomew sits alone in the corner, quietly dipping a crust of bread in oil. When someone asks him what happens next, he shrugs. We wait, he says, and we see if heaven listens. You step out into the cool night. Above, the stars blink faintly. Below in the fields, the chewing continues. You wake the next morning to a curious quiet. Not the absence of birdsong. There are sparrows chirping on rooftops, and a rooster is desperately trying to out-sing a donkey 2 houses down. But there's a different hush in the air, like the kind you get after snowfall or an argument that went too far. You step out into the fields. They're still crawling. The caterpillars are there unfazed, plodding from leaf to leaf, nibbling, flinching only when the wind gets too strong. No lightning bolts, no divine fire, no spontaneous pest collapse, just the slow rhythm of nature, chewing through what's left of the village's hard-won greenery. By mid-morning, the villagers are in uproar. They crowd outside the church demanding answers. The excommunication didn't work. The caterpillars are not deterred. If anything, they seem slightly plumper. Didn't we curse them? Someone shouts. Yes, says a monk, but perhaps they're resisting. Another mutters maybe they weren't baptized in the first place. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. The judge, Canon Etienne, is visibly annoyed. He had hoped to return to the city by now. He pulls his traveling cloak tighter and insists that the process is spiritual, not immediate. The effects are not always visible, he says. Grace moves at the speed of God. That's not helpful. So the case escalates. The village sends a messenger to the Archbishop's office in autumn, requesting further legal proceedings. The trial, it turns out, was not just a village spectacle. It has now become a matter for a higher ecclesiastical review. The caterpillars, in their complete and total obliviousness, are now the subject of an appeal. This apparently is not uncommon. In several document cases from the 14th and 15th centuries, insect trials traveled through entire ecclesiastical hierarchies, some even reaching the Vatican's doorstep. Historians still argue why the Church tolerated such farce. Some believe it was a way to reinforce structure. When everything was chaotic, a legal process, even against bugs, gave people a sense of order. Others think it was simply the result of clerical boredom, meeting theological overreach. Meanwhile, back in the village, life gets pettier. Someone accuses a neighbor of harboring the caterpillars intentionally. They're fatter, on his beats, a woman hisses. Someone else suggests the caterpillars are possessed and proposes calling in a traveling exorcist. The local tavern starts serving heretic soup, made from overcooked greens and whatever hasn't been eaten yet. Bartholomew doesn't join in the panic. He walks the same routes as always, performing quiet readings at the field's edge. He's weary now, eyes ringed with dark circles, but there's something defiant in his calm. You walk with him one morning. They're still here, you say, even after the excommunication. He nods. Yes. That doesn't mean the ritual failed. You raise an eyebrow. It means the world is messier than we want it to be, he says. Judgment is neat, nature isn't. You reach a patch of chewed parsley where dozens of caterpillars lounge like tiny tourists on ruined sunbeds. Bartholomew kneels. They don't know they were cursed, he whispers. And perhaps that's mercy too. That night the wind howls. A storm brews lightning flashes over the hills, and for a moment you think maybe this will be the miracle. The curse's delayed effect. The divine judgment finally arriving. You watch from a farmhouse porch, staring across the dark fields. Raindrops fall like pinpricks. Thunder grumbles. But when morning comes, the caterpillars are still there. It's now day 10 since the trial 4, since the excommunication, and you're starting to sense a slow unraveling. The fields have become less a battleground and more a monument to absurdity. Crops are shredded, roots are hollowed. The cabbage looks like someone tried to use it as paper lace. You walk through it all like a tourist in a ruin, except the ruins are fresh and still crawling. The town's patience is frayed to threads. Even the clergy are showing signs of fatigue. The bell that was once rung each morning as part of the spiritual warning to the caterpillars has gone mysteriously silent. The monk who rang it was last seen sleeping under the bell rope face buried in a sack of flour. The townsfolk have stopped gathering in groups. Now they mutter individually. Tired of trials, bored of sermons, hungry, bitter. A kind of resignation has taken root. You hear someone say, maybe we should just move to the next valley. Another answers, and what if the caterpillars come too? That's when the idea of negotiation resurfaces. Yes, again, a small group of elders approaches Canon Etienne with a strange proposal: try talking to the caterpillars. Not in Latin, not with legal threats, just a final attempt to reason. You're not sure whether to admire the hope or question the collective grip on reality. But the judge agrees. And so for the first time since the trial began, the church permits a direct petition. You join the procession that afternoon. Bartholomew is naturally the one chosen to deliver the appeal. He doesn't object. If anything, he seems quietly honored. The group walks to the largest field, what's left of it, and stands at the edge of a row of half-eaten parsnips. Bartholomew steps forward, holding no scroll, no candle, no cross, just his voice. Caterpillars, he says gently, you've been asked, you've been offered, you've been warned. If there is any mercy in you, any instinct, any drift of soul, go. Leave this place. Find another. Silence. He pauses. If not for us, he continues then for the fields, for the trees, for the birds who feed on you. Let there be balance again. The only response is the wind, and the chewing, always the chewing. Still, it's the first time you notice some of them are starting to slow. That night in the tavern, you sit near the hearth with 3 farmers who've spent the last week watching the caterpillars closely. They claim softly, cautiously, that their numbers are dwindling. I saw fewer today than yesterday, says one. They're fatter, says another. Maybe they're full. Bartholomew is there, too, sitting in the corner, hands wrapped around a clay mug. He doesn't smile, but he does meet your eyes and nod as if to say, hope is not foolish, just tired. Historians still argue whether this negotiation phase was formally part of ecclesiastical insect trials or merely local improvisation. But records suggest similar appeals were made in other villages, some involving threats of storms, others promises of sanctuary. Sometimes they worked, sometimes not. You step outside into the crisp night. The wind has changed direction. Clouds scatter, and in the distance the fields look lighter. Not empty, but less alive with crawling motion. It could be a trick of the moonlight, or it could be something else. You stand quietly listening, not for chewing, but for silence. By dawn, you're already in the fields, barefoot this time, the dew soaking your heels, the air holding its breath. You scan the rows of battered vegetables, expecting the usual squirming procession of fuzz and mandibles, but instead you find stillness, not total. A few stragglers remain inching lazily, curled like forgotten commas on the underside of a chard leaf. But the frenzy is gone. The thickets of crawling bodies, the pulsing waves of green-on-green movement, they've vanished. You kneel, listen. No chewing. Your heart skips. It's not victory exactly, but it feels like a pause, a quiet the village hasn't heard in weeks. Word spreads fast. By midday, a crowd is gathered at the edge of the largest plot. Farmers, priests, children, goats, everyone's watching the dirt like it might cough up a miracle. Father Dennis arrives, first cloak flapping dramatically. He surveys the ground and mutters something about divine justice. The excommunication, he says loudly, has been accepted. The creatures are gone. Then comes Canon Etienne. He says nothing at first, just crouches near a patch of scorched leeks and rubs a thumb through the dirt. Then no eggs, no larvae. Bartholomew arrives last, mud on his shoes, a worn leather book tucked under his arm. He doesn't speak, just closes his eyes, exhales deeply, and touches the soil like greeting a friend who finally woke from a coma. You hear murmurs ripple through the crowd. They're really gone. Maybe they found that scrubland. Maybe the wind turned. Maybe we did it. Historians still argue why the caterpillars left. Some records attribute it to sudden changes in temperature. Others note that thaumatomapia, pidiocampa. The pine processionary caterpillar often self-regulates via food scarcity. When they run out of green, they simply wander off looking for more. The trial may have coincided with the end of their natural feeding cycle. But the villagers don't care about entomology. They care that their crops have stopped disappearing. That night there's a feast not of fresh vegetables, but of whatever's left. Barley soup, dried apples, stale rye bread soaked in weak wine. It's the first time anyone's laughed in days. At one table, two elderly women argue over whether the final prayer or the holy candle did the trick. At another, a teenager dramatically reenacts Bartholomew's caterpillar plea, complete with flailing arms and exaggerated squeaks. Even Father Dennis loosens up, accepting a second cup of wine and quietly admitting to someone that he used to talk to mice as a boy. Bartholomew says nothing all evening, but you catch him smiling once, just once, when a child offers him a single, untouched radish, her first miracle vegetable. Later you find him sitting outside the chapel, legs stretched, gazing up at the stars. You think it was the trial, you ask? He chuckles. I think they got full. You sit beside him. You think it mattered? He takes a long breath. To the people, yes. To the caterpillars, probably not. But sometimes when nothing makes sense, you need to do something. Something that reminds you the world can be spoken to, even if it doesn't answer. You nod. The stars don't answer either, but they're beautiful. A soft breeze rolls through the village. Far off in the hills, an owl hoots once, as if marking the end of a chapter. For now, the fields are still, but no one dares call it peace. Not yet. The caterpillars are gone, but the paperwork is just beginning. You arrive at the chapter house the next morning to find Canon Etienne dictating a report to a sleepy-eyed scribe whose quill hand is visibly cramping. Beside them, an official parchment is being prepared, the formal record of departure of the accused beasts. You glance over the opening lines. In the year of our Lord, 1457, on the 12th day, following the issuance of ecclesiastical summons, the accused creatures did, of their own accord or divine will, vacate the cultivated lands of Saint Lucien. You stifle a grin. The scroll goes on for 4 full pages. There are names, titles, boundaries, weather conditions, and even a brief mention of unseasonably devout wind direction. It reads like a war treaty signed by the world's tiniest deserters. Villagers trickle in and out throughout the day, asking whether the fields are officially holy again. One child offers to draw a picture of the trial day for the church wall. His sketch includes a caterpillar wearing a hat and weeping on a witness stand. Bartholomew helps seal the document with beeswax. He's still quiet, but no longer weary. You can tell the burden's lifted. Not because he won, there's no real winning here, but because for once his words were heard. If not by the insects, then by the people. Later that week, another surprise arrives. Letters from nearby villages. Turns out word of the caterpillar trial is spread. Some neighboring parishes are inspired. Others are skeptical. A few are deeply confused. One note reads, "We too suffer from burrowing voles." Would the Honorable Father Bartholomew consider representation? Another is more critical. St. Bernard saw no reason to spiritualize slugs. We simply added salt. Historians still argue whether this cross-parish correspondence suggests early environmental consciousness or just collective nervous breakdowns wrapped in Latin. Bartholomew responds graciously, declining to represent voles, but offering to share his prayer cycle for non-verbal creatures in distress. The judge departs soon after, scrolls in hand, promising to file the trial record with the diocesan library. He bids Bartholomew farewell with a handshake, and you think you see something like respect in his eyes. Even Father Dennis begrudgingly acknowledges the outcome. They're gone. That's what matters. Whether by miracle or indigestion, I leave to the Lord. You help clean the church garden one afternoon and overhear him muttering to the soil, "If you crawl, I will curse again." A few days later, the first green shoots reappear. Tiny leaves unfurl from wounded stalks, a handful of charred leaves like green flags after a storm. The village begins to prepare for a second planting. They'll plant fewer rows this time, less vulnerable, more hardy roots, just in case the caterpillars return. And yes, some of them might. That's the quiet truth no one voices aloud. This peace is likely temporary. Nature doesn't sign contracts. But rituals give people something to believe in, even if they're just lines drawn in dirt. One night, as you sit near the fields, watching the wind roll over the hills, Bartholomew joins you. "Do you think they'll come back?" you ask. He shrugs. "Maybe." "And what then?" He looks toward the moon. "Then we try again." The caterpillars, it turns out, weren't the only ones being watched. 2 weeks after the trial concludes, an official courier arrives on horseback from the episcopal city of Autun, draped in red and gold, with documents sealed in ribbon and wax. He carries a letter addressed to the parish of Saint-Lucien, and more pointedly to Father Bartholomew himself. It begins formally. "Let it be known to the clergy of Saint-Lucien that the case of the unlawful infestation, having been settled through public ecclesiastical process and with due diligence, has come to the attention of His Grace, the Archbishop of Autun." You stop reading aloud and glance at Bartholomew. He's smiling nervously, like someone who's just been told their poem was read at the royal court. Upside down. The letter continues with both praise and concern. Praise for the decorum, for the faithfulness shown in treating even the lesser beasts of creation with due care. Concern that this trial may encourage similar efforts without episcopal approval. In short, you've inspired a minor administrative panic. It turns out 3 other parishes have now begun drafting trials of their own. One against a particularly aggressive flock of geese, another more ambitiously against mildew. That's right, fungus. Historians still argue whether these were mockeries or sincere efforts to replicate a successful model. One parchment fragment from a southern abbey insists that lichens can be reasoned with if addressed during Lent. Still, the Archbishop's letter concludes with an unexpected twist, a request for Bartholomew to write a full account of the trial to be copied and stored in the diocesan record as a case study. "I think they want to make an example of you," you whisper. Bartholomew nods. "Better than making an example of the caterpillars." You spend the next several days helping him compile the scroll, half-legal treatise, half-diary, all strange. It details the timeline, the proceedings, the evidence, and even includes a transcript of his address to the insects. He titles it "On Beast Without Guilt, a Modest Defense of the Unknowing Offender." Canon Etienne would have preferred "Report on Insect Dispersal following ecclesiastical admonition." You both compromise. The scroll goes off with the courier, tied with blue ribbon and tucked beside salted cheese and a dried pear. And life, almost astonishingly, begins to resume. The village replants, slowly, carefully, with fewer crops, but more intention. Barley, which the caterpillars avoided. Turnips in deeper soil. Beans trellised on frames so they can be covered quickly. Bartholomew organizes a day of prayer for the soil, not a ritual of defense, but of gratitude. He offers a short homily in the field. "May we be mindful of what we plant, and of who we plant beside." You notice people linger afterward, not out of obligation, but because they feel something like peace, or at least the beginning of peace. One boy places a ring of stones around a carrot sprout to protect it from trials. You smile. Not everything is healed. The tavern cellar is still too empty. Several families have had to ration their winter stores early. And in the evenings, some villagers still walk the fields with torches just in case the swarm returns. But something has shifted. Not the weather, not the bugs, the people. They've remembered that even fear can be shaped into something structured, something purposeful, even if the shape is strange and full of fuzz. That week, a traveling friar passes through. He's heard whispers of the caterpillar court and wants to see the field for himself. You walk him there, letting him inspect the leftover rows. He laughs quietly. "You put caterpillars on trial?" "We gave them a chance to explain," Bartholomew says. The friar chuckles again. "And what did they say?" Nothing, Bartholomew replies, but maybe they listen. Summer deepens. The days stretch longer, the nights warmer. The fields, though battered, begin to green again, slowly, shyly, like a child peeking out after a scolding. And while the caterpillars remain gone, the questions have not. You overhear them everywhere at the well in the tavern beside the chapel. Was it the trial that made them leave? Did the curse work? Or was it just the rain? The truth no one really knows. And that uncertainty has created an unexpected side effect: curiosity. People start to dig, literally and metaphorically. Children gather around Father Bartholomew and ask if snails can be reasoned with. A farmer brings a dead mole to the church, unsure whether to bury it or fine it. You help a group of villagers unearth old scrolls from the parish's dusty storeroom. Among the moldy ledgers and cracked hymnals, you find records of previous trials: rats in 1372, locusts in 1310, a goat accused of theft in 1294. One particularly bizarre entry documents the trial of the wind, in which a local bishop attempted to ban a series of unseasonal gusts. It failed, obviously. Historians still debate how seriously these records were kept. Some were no doubt ritual theater meant to soothe angry crowds. Others seem earnest, especially when they include lists of charges, witnesses, and even appointed legal counsel. And then you find a letter, stuffed in the back of a missal, yellowed with age, barely legible. To condemn what cannot understand is not justice, but noise dressed in robes. But to listen, that is divine. No signature, no date. Just a little note from one weary cleric to another, maybe, or a prank, or a truth. Bartholomew copies it into his own journal without comment. Meanwhile, the harvest begins not of full crops, but of whatever survived the caterpillar's siege. The yields are meager but meaningful. You join the others to gather charred onions and a few heroic heads of cabbage that somehow escape the teeth of judgment. The air smells sweet with crushed herbs and sweat. There's no celebration, but there's relief. That night, the villagers gather under a canopy of stars, not to perform another trial, not to mourn, just to share bread and stories. A blacksmith sings a slow, wandering ballad about the little lawyer worm, which includes verses about courtroom hats and tiny spectacles. It's wildly inaccurate, but undeniably catchy. Even Father Dennis chuckles once. Later, Father Bartholomew rises to speak, not with a sermon, but a tale. Once he says there was a village where justice was loud and mercy was quiet. The people held a trial. They summoned the wind. They offered exile to caterpillars. They did everything they could to make the world feel smaller, safer, more obedient. He pauses, voice softer. But the world did not answer. It simply turned. No moral, no conclusion, just a shrug of the soul. You walk back to your lodging beneath a pale moon, the grass whispering beneath your steps. And as you pass the field, bare moonlit, dotted with new growth, you swear for the briefest moment that you see something moving along a vine. But when you look closer, it's only a leaf. And it's not chewing. By the end of August, the village has returned to something resembling normal, though with a slightly more wary respect for anything with more than 4 legs. The fields are recovering, if patchy. The days are still long, and the air smells less like crisis, more like dirt and sweat and possibility. But the memory of the trial, that's not going anywhere. In fact, it's outspreading. Travelers begin arriving just to ask questions. A monk from Lyon with an oversized scroll case and a slight limp. A lady from Dijon with a trained spaniel and an exaggerated accent. A minor noble's steward sent, unofficially of course, to investigate procedural options in case of hedgehog overpopulation. Bartholomew hosts them all. He's become something of a celebrity, not the kind with flowers and cheers, but the quieter, more enduring kind, the man who talked to caterpillars and made the church listen. Whether that's a compliment or a polite insult depends on the speaker. You watch him navigate it with the same calm patience he showed the bugs. One afternoon, he invites you to walk the riverbank with him. He brings bread, a flask of cider, and a new scroll just arrived from the bishopric. It's official, the trial has been entered into the ecclesiastical archive, categorized under extraordinary cases involving nonverbal creatures. A mouthful, yes, but a recognition nonetheless. Attached is a smaller note. While we do not recommend further proceedings of this nature without explicit oversight, we commend the dignity with which the matter was conducted. Translation, don't do it again. But also thanks for not embarrassing us. Bartholomew reads it twice, then folds it carefully and tucks it away. It's strange, he says, tossing breadcrumbs to the water, to be remembered for what was never meant to matter. You nod, but it did matter, maybe he replies. Or maybe we just needed something to believe in for a while. Historians still argue whether the caterpillar trial of Saint-Lucien had any long-term impact. Some claim it marked a turning point in pre-modern ecological awareness, a tiny, fluttering moment of compassion in a brutal era. Others dismiss it as religious theater, no different than trial plays or mystery pageants. But there were echoes. Decades later, records show similar trials held for crows, snails, and even a thieving swarm of wasps. Bartholomew's arguments, preserved in careful cursive, were quoted in at least 2 of them. One bishop, writing in 1479, called him the advocate of the innocent beast, which sounds noble until you realize the next sentence refers to exiling frogs from a cathedral. Still, for a village once consumed by panic and scarcity, the trial becomes legend. Children reenacted in the fields, draping worms in tiny cloaks and setting up stick courthouses. One girl insists she's writing her own scroll titled The Trial of the Loud Chicken. In the tavern, a wooden carving of a caterpillar is nailed above the hearth. The bartender claims it fell off twice during the trial and refused to stay upright until the bugs left. It's probably just a bent nail, but no one fixes it now. And in the churchyard, a narrow plaque is placed near the garden. It reads, "Here mercy was attempted." No names, no dates, just a quiet note carved in stone. That night, you find Bartholomew writing by candlelight. He doesn't look up, but he speaks as you approach. They'll come back, maybe next year, maybe in 20. The caterpillars. Yes, or something like them. There's always something hungry. You sit down. And what do we do then? He dips his quill again. Maybe we plant extra. Maybe we speak kindly. Maybe we shout. Maybe we weep. He shrugs, or maybe we try again. Outside, the wind picks up, not ominously, just gently like the earth breathing in its sleep. Autumn rolls in like a deep sigh. The air turns sharper, the skies more reflective. The leaves along the village road flame into golds and reds before falling like quiet applause on the earth. Harvest is modest this year, no miracle bounty, but enough. Enough to make it through. Enough to call it survival. The caterpillars don't return. But their trial lingers in conversation, in ritual, in the way people now pause before swatting a fly. It's not reverence, let's not get carried away, but it is awareness, a shift in posture, the tiniest recalibration of what it means to live beside other living things, even when they're fuzzy and inconvenient. And then on a chilly market morning, a stranger arrives. He's thin, wrapped in a scholar's robe patched at the elbows, carries nothing but a bundle of papers and a faint smell of ink. He approaches the church bows low and asks if he might study the original records of the caterpillar proceedings. Bartholomew oblige. You watch as the man pores over the trial scrolls, flipping slowly, murmuring phrases like fascinating and the indirect invitation clause. At one point he chuckles aloud, reading the formal description of the accused, known to be in great numbers, hairy of back and stubborn of spirit. He looks up. You're aware, he says, that this may be the most complete example we have of a non-mammalian ecclesiastical defense. Bartholomew just smiles and pours him some tea. Later, the scholar tells you about other cases one's lost to time. A trial of field mice in Provence, which ended in a duel between two monks. A rooster excommunicated for crowing during communion. A beehive blessed by accident, and then stolen by a rival village. You ask what he thinks they all mean. He pauses. I think he says we've always needed someone to blame for the things we can't control. And when we grow tired of blaming each other, we look to animals, or storms, or insects. But blaming doesn't fix anything, you reply. He nods, which is why your trial stands out. It wasn't about punishment. It was about process, about being seen trying. You're quiet for a moment. Historians still argue about the purpose of these trials. Were they legal, spiritual, performative, or all three? But to this scholar, and increasingly to you, they feel like echoes, attempts to speak across the silence between species, to name the unknown, to cast order into the wilderness. Before the scholar departs, he asks to take a copy of Bartholomew's closing remarks. He promises to include the trial in a treatise he's writing. On Beasts and Burdens, the Law Beyond Language. Bartholomew agrees on one condition, that he include the names of the farmers who testified, not just the priests. They were hungry, he says, but they still showed up. After the scholar leaves, you wander back into the fields. There are no caterpillars, just turned soil cover crops and the hum of insects preparing for winter. But as you crouch beside a beet sprout, you notice a single silk thread, barely visible, dancing in the breeze. A cocoon, maybe, a whisper of return. You touch the thread gently. It clings to your finger, impossibly light. And you think maybe that's all any of this was. Not a battle, not a miracle. Just a thread between worlds. The beginning of a conversation. Winter arrives with little fanfare. No great blizzard. No celestial signs. Just a slow thickening of the cold frost creeping in like a polite guest who doesn't need announcing. The fields harden. The wind howls more often. And the village huddles inward closer fires, smaller talk, quieter days. The caterpillars are no longer mentioned with fear. They're now the punchline to tavern jokes embroidered into pillowcases and somehow featured in a nativity puppet show involving a woolly bug in a halo. You don't ask, but when the snow first falls, you're out in the chapel garden with Bartholomew. He's pruning back the herbs, carefully covering the roots with straw. A caterpillar wouldn't last 5 seconds in this weather, but still he moves gently, like someone preparing a bed for a guest who may or may not return. You know, he says, brushing snow from his sleeves, I've been thinking about that last prayer I gave. The one they all said did nothing. You nod, you remember it well. I was wrong, he continues. Not in what I asked, but in who I asked it for. You glance up. I wasn't praying to the caterpillars, he says. I was praying to us. To be decent, to be less afraid. Historians still argue whether the caterpillar trial actually had any influence on future church policy. There's no direct edict, no papal letter declaring caterpillars under divine jurisdiction. And yet, something shifted. Small references start popping up in minor theological tracts. Notes about humility in creation. Marginal scribbles beside Psalm 148. Praise him creeping things. A priest in Cologne pens a sermon called On the Dignity of the Gnawed Leaf and Saint Lucin. It never hosts another animal trial, but for generations, the parish records continue to include a small footnote in the weather log, no infestations, thanks be to God and Bartholomew. The priest himself never leaves. He lives out his life in that same stone chapel, tending herbs, copying psalms quietly, answering the occasional letter from odd monks, seeking legal tips for mollusk-related disturbances. He dies in his late 60s, peacefully, in spring. They bury him near the edge of the field, right where he used to kneel and talk to the kale. There's no statue, no relic, just a wooden marker carved with a single line. He spoke for those who couldn't. Years later you return, older, slower. A few more aches than you remember. You sit beside the marker as the breeze stirs through the weeds and you listen. Not for chewing, not for hymns, just for the soft rustle of a world still trying to balance itself. Imperfectly, patiently, weirdly. And that's when you see it on the edge of a dandelion, barely visible against the green. A caterpillar, small, bristly, innocent of any prior litigation. It doesn't know it was once the center of a trial, a ritual, a moral debate wrapped in Latin. It doesn't know it made people fight and pray and write poems. It just inches forward. And you smile and let it be. So now as the fields fall silent and your thoughts begin to float like snowflakes, let your mind settle gently into stillness. You've journeyed through a world that once tried to reason with caterpillars, where robed figures gathered in candlelight to speak solemn Latin to oblivious insects, and where mercy was extended even when it made no sense at all. You've walked among villagers who, instead of reaching for swords or salt, reached for scrolls, who, despite hunger and fear, chose to hold a trial instead of a torch. You've listened to voices echo across centuries, some skeptical, some reverent, all trying to make sense of a world that doesn't always answer back. Let that thought comfort you, that it's okay not to have answers. It's okay to talk to the wind, to kneel beside a leaf and hope anything is listening. Because maybe the act of trying's what matters. Maybe that's what justice really is, an act of faith, not force. So now close your eyes. Let the image of that final caterpillar linger soft and slow and unbothered, inching along under a sky full of stars. No judgment, no trials, just movement. Just life. And just like that, let the night take over. Let the quiet carry you. You are safe. You are enough. You can rest now.